you?
Yeah.
What brings you here?
Lots of things. Adventure, love. I want to dance. I want to celebrate. I want to sing. My heart wants to sing. And this is a wonderful atmosphere to sing in and to dance in. Okay?
How long have you been a follower of Bhagwan?
7 years.
And what sort of a difference has it made in your life?
Total difference. Total difference. It saved my life once.
It saved your life?
Yes. I was stricken with a disease called Guillain-Barré, in which the body is completely paralyzed. The mind is trapped in a body that won't work. And you have an itch and you can't scratch it and you can't speak, so you can't tell anybody about it. And the meditations of Bhagwan were very beautiful. And I divorced myself from my painful body during this period. And I saw his image and I remembered his words, and they were lovely.
And you were healed?
Eventually I was healed. Here I am. Here I am.
All right.
Yeah.
That'll do it.
Jewish photographers around.
Hi, it's me.
Thanks.
I like it. And for some reason he got way over here, and he said he didn't have steering. When he gets to the bank, obviously I can see where he's turning his wheels. If he's going 3 miles an hour, why he didn't stop way back here is beyond me.
So you're telling me it was no accident?
Oh, I'm not saying that. No, what I'm saying is that, you know, I don't know why he didn't stop way back here. And if he can turn his wheels there, why couldn't he turn them here? If that's the case, I'm not, you know, I wasn't driving the truck.
Let me ask you this. Have there ever been any accidents like this in this road before?
I couldn't tell you. I've never investigated any down here. Like
This is the first one you've seen like this?
Well, yeah, to me this isn't really an accident. If it's a truck failure, which he claims it is, you know, he just drove off too far to the side, it appears. Why he wasn't on that side, I don't know. But
And they're blocking the road pretty effectively. Huh?
oh, they did an excellent job of blocking the road. Couldn't have done it any better.
verdict, Sheila? What's the verdict?
Verdict is that I'm glad that the man's life is safe, and I don't give a shit about what people think about cynical approach.
Is this a joke or not? Are you joking to me?
No, I'm not joking. I'm serious. This is my few people's lives is concerned here. This is no joke. This is no joke. I mean, these people's lives are in danger, and somebody wants to make a cynical comment and judge it and abuse it. It's not right. But they have a letter written that they are saying about
Roll it all the way off the edge of the cliff, and maybe that would be advisable, but I wouldn't.
Has this ever happened before?
Oh, 3 times a week.
Look at the state of the roads. I mean,
No, has this ever happened before?
all over the world? Yeah.
No, here, at the ranch. Has this ever happened before?
Yeah.
Sure.
You've
We've
ditched,
got trucks quit on the road.
have you ditched a truck like this on the road ever before?
Sure. I ditched a van right here once before.
When was the last time it happened?
I don't know.
July the 6th. No, July the 4th, the last time I ditched a truck on this road.
1412 was it?
No, it must have been 1875. I think my grandmother was driving actually at the time. No, she wasn't. No, it was my granddaughter.
How about the scraper?
The scraper, yeah.
That was July 9th,
Yeah.
1976.
Yeah.
Twice.
What?
Well, I think we tried.
So you're really getting in the way. We're trying to take some pictures here, and you're standing in the way of the plane.
doesn't slide. We get it off, and then we.
Sorry.
The tip is, what I'm seeing, if we drop the trailer right there, we're dealing with a little bit of an angle to take the contract off.
Yeah.
If we move it, if we move it at all, we're going to deal with ever had.
Mr. Ruby. Hi.
Oh, God.
Okay.
All right. Everybody's all right. I was on my way to city of Rajneesh. Finally, I agreed to go to city of Rajneesh with them.
Sorry, Mom.
What? Okay, who did it? What
I'm not
happened?
even dressed for this. I thought my car was going to keep me warm. What am I going to do? Good.
What's up?
What's up? I was going to city of Rajneesh. They wanted me to look at some stuff there. Good morning. Do you have to?
I have to.
All right. If you have to, I mean, I'm here. Vitsi, do you want to, Padma, do you want to check? They're checking how people are. People are okay? Safe?
Okay, let's do it. Go ahead.
Heard something on the radio. On the video.
La 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 la.
who are clever enough not to be caught, clever enough to cheat people by giving them false hopes, phony utopias. We don't have any politics here. And we don't have any religion that they think is religion. My religion is a way of life. It is not a way of prayer. It is a way of living. Can you mix love with state? How you will mix? They are unmixable. And this phenomenon that is happening here is of the same quality as love. We love life. And we want to live it in its fullness. Who cares about your politics and your state?
I wanted to say that because I know when I was talking to someone about it.
The most beautiful people I have come across in my life. That those commissioners will be shot by the redneck bigots. But I call them courageous people because they did not care for that, but they want their county to be within the law, fair, and equal justice to all. They want their country to be by the people, for the people. And I told them that even though I'm a religious person, when I'm not doing religious work, I will campaign for them. And I supported them fully. And I said, you're both of you capable people, capable human beings. And you will be able to take good care of these people throughout the county. 6th of November you vote. And I guarantee you there will be people to help you to vote and explain to you which are the good candidates, which are the candidates who are trying to and all of it, which are after us and trying to cut this program down and everything. But they're going to leave. I tell you, they're going to, you see them on the news clips, what they say. I mean, they are ugly. I have actually sat in front of them, and actually I had to leave them and take shower afterwards. One person, I gave them hell. But I tell you, Bhagwan doesn't see me as fiery as I should be. Maybe you all will help me become as fiery. Maybe your love will make me fiery. Right.
just tell you one story that happened to me when first I moved to Rajneeshpuram here, and I used to have my office in city of Rajneesh. And one very beautiful black sannyasin was secretary helping me create this place, helping me with the work here. Her name is Rabia. She's a very gorgeous woman. And what happened was, one day mayor pulled me aside. That was the old mayor, Margaret Hill. Prune face. Pulled me aside and said to me, couldn't you keep that black woman on the ranch because the whole city is getting upset? Well, I wanted to smack her. I should have. But I maintained my cool. But now it is showing up more visibly. It is so ugly out. You don't know. And I want to protect you people. I mean, if you want to go to vote out there, we'll have to find out how the law works. Some politician here, KD or somebody can explain, or precinct person can explain how the voting works. And the two commissioners who would like to run for the position, this entire community, and that's not profane for him.
It's time to have a lid, John. Hey, get Ronald Reagan up here.
I'm sorry? The names of them, one was Pat Buchanan and another was Tom Bennett. And they shut up afterwards. That's what...
You'll put it right out in the center, aren't you?
He's talking to his radio.
title, of course, playing off Wild Wild Country, the recent Netflix documentary on this same topic. This program is part of the Famous Cases series of the U.S. District Court Historical Society. It's being presented jointly by the Oregon Historical Society and the U.S. District Court Historical Society. Now, the efforts of many people have contributed to this program, but I'd like to single out three. Carrie Timchuk, the longtime executive director of the Historical Society, Julie Engblom, current president of the District Court Historical Society, and Doug Paul, a partner at Perkins Coie, who is a board member of both of those organizations, and who's done 99% of the legwork and the legal work to put this program together. So let's give those folks, and particularly Doug Paul, a hand. Thank you, Doug. Now, I was asked to moderate this program because I'm a judge, and lawyers are supposed to pay attention to what judges say, although I've found that's not always the case. And also because I have one of these, and I know how to use it if I need to, but I expect that we'll have a civil, thoughtful discussion about some really interesting and important issues that arose from the Rajneeshpuram episode, and we're delighted that you've joined us. Now, I want to introduce our speakers who are going to come up one at a time, and then we'll have a discussion with all of us on stage when we do some Q&A towards the end of the program. But I want to introduce them just very briefly at the outset, so I won't be interfering with the flow of the talks. If you're a lawyer in Oregon, you are or ought to be familiar with three of them, and if you watch the Netflix series or were paying attention to the Rajneeshpuram story in the early 1980s, you'll also know the fourth speaker. But I'll introduce him first. Prem Niran. Prem, you want to raise your hand there? Niran was the mastermind of legal strategy for the Rajneesh community during the 1980s. He was a respected litigator and entertainment industry lawyer with the Manat Phelps firm in Los Angeles in the 1970s. He became a follower of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, went to India, and then he moved to Oregon when the Bhagwan moved here from India in 1981. Now, for those of you who didn't watch the Netflix series or haven't paid attention to these things, Bhagwan later changed his name to Osho, and you may sometimes hear referred to as Osho. After the events we're discussing tonight, Niran continued his law practice. He told me he still has a few clients, and he now also does mediation and consulting, but also teaches meditation. Mediation and meditation, I think that's what I want to do in my semi-retirement. Judge John Gelderks was an Oregon Circuit Court judge, the only judge at the time in the district that included Wasco County, where the Bhagwan and his followers landed. And Judge Gelderks handled a number of cases related to activities in Rajneeshpuram. Judge Gelderks was always considered one of our state's best trial court judges, and he later was appointed a federal magistrate and had a distinguished career in the federal judiciary. Bob Weaver was the assistant U.S. attorney in charge of the criminal division of that office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, in the early 1980s, working under U.S. Attorney Charles Turner. He's here because he was the point person for the federal government's criminal investigations and prosecutions against members of the Rajneesh community. Bob later joined the Garvey Schubert firm and has long been a go-to litigator in Portland for white-collar criminal defense and complex business litigation. And our final speaker will be Bill Gary, who was Solicitor General and Deputy Attorney General under Attorney General Dave Frohnmeyer, and he was the person who headed up the state's various legal efforts, both civil and criminal, in connection with Rajneeshpuram. After leaving the AG's office, Bill became and remains a partner in the Harang Long firm and works out of the offices in Eugene and Portland. He frequently appears before the Oregon Supreme Court and federal and state courts across Oregon and elsewhere. Now, this may be the first time that we've had Niran and Mr. Weaver and Mr. Gary on the stage together, and we're delighted that they were willing to do this. They were vigorous advocates for opposing positions in a number of the cases that you're going to hear about, although there were many, many other lawyers involved. In fact, when this program was announced, you wouldn't believe the number of lawyers we got inquiries from saying, I want to be on the program, I want to be on the program. I had a case, I represented a witness. And we had to draw the line at these people who were sort of more of the strategic thinkers and handled the really important parts of the litigation. Now, the way we're going to proceed is this. Naren will open with a short introduction about who Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and his followers were and why they came to Oregon. Then Judge Gelderks will talk about the initial reactions of people in Central Oregon when the Rajneeshis arrived. He has both the perspective of a native Oregonian living east of the mountains. I guess we consider Hood River sort of east of the mountains, although I just talked to our friends from the Dalles, and they said that's not true. But he was the judge who probably had the first contact with the folks from Rajneeshpuram in connection with some permitting issues, and he was involved in the Thousand Friends land use case and had a lot of contact because he was the judge in Wasco County. Bob Weaver will cover the immigration fraud investigation, the other crimes that were uncovered after Ma Anand Sheila left the ranch in September 1985, Bhagwan's attempt to flee from Rajneeshpuram to Bermuda in later that year, and the resolution of the various federal cases. And then Bill Gary will describe the really interesting church-state issues that were raised by the very existence of the city of Rajneeshpuram in the Attorney General's view and Judge Fry's view. The Rajneesh attempts to control Wasco County government and the state criminal investigations and prosecutions. We'll then bring Naren back to the podium to explain his perspective on the legal issues that Bob and Bill will talk about, and more generally about how the Rajneeshi community responded to the legal challenges they faced and the social and political climate they found themselves in. And if that's not enough, we're reserving time for questions, and we'll have all four of our speakers up on the stage. There are cards. I think, what do the cards look like? They're red cards, sort of in the spirit of Rajneeshpuram. Red cards for you to write your questions on, and we'll collect them about an hour into the presentations. Now, we want you to get your money's worth, so we're going to do 2 hours without stopping. That means I need to tell you where the restrooms are, and if any of you or any of the people on the stage or the speakers need to use the restrooms, you can either go down that stairs. There's one at that end, just at the bottom of the stairs, and there's another one. Might be easier to go out and down and through the big reception room downstairs, and you'll see the signs to restrooms. So, without further ado, Prem Naren.
Good evening. I just need to get this hooked up. Can I move your stuff, Justice? I think all I need to do is plug this HDMI cable in. I'm not exactly a whiz at this thing. Tech people? Stephen? There we go. The older you get, it's amazing how time flies, you know. This is a more attentive audience than I can remember having at a public gathering in the state of Oregon. I remember walking down the street one time in my maroon three-piece suit, walking to a courthouse, carrying a couple big bags, and some construction guy yelled at me, "Go home." I looked, I thought, I was born corner of St. Joseph's Hospital, right here. Where am I supposed to go? It's always been a good question. Where am I supposed to go? So who was Osho, who were we, and why did we come to Oregon? In India, for 5 or 6 years before 1981, especially in a couple of years before, the ashram in Pune, the commune, was filled overflowing, more and more Westerners coming, more and more people interested in meditation. Can you hear me all right? What? No? Better? Tried to find land in India. Osho was unpopular with politicians there too. So we had trouble finding it. And then a couple of people talked to him about coming to America, who were Americans, wanted him to come if they could get a place together here. They showed him the Bill of Rights. He liked that freedom of religion thing, freedom of speech thing. And so he said, if you can make it happen, I'll come. Osho, over the years, earlier known as Bhagwan, later, before he died, became known as Osho, which is a Japanese honorarium for master or teacher, from a disciple to a teacher. Dalai Lama called him an enlightened master. Deepak Chopra talked about his brilliant insights. Sting and Madonna liked his work a lot, as you can see in their quotes. In 1981, Osho was having increasingly difficult problems with his back. He had a bunch of medical problems. He had diabetes and a lot of medical problems, but his back had been problems for years. And they were talking about they had to be ready to take him to a place where it would be safe for him to have surgery. India, back then, they had a lot of good surgeons, but finding a place that was really sanitary and all that sort of stuff is not so easy. And the best surgeons, of course, would be here. So they applied for a visitor's visa for medical reasons. It was granted, and they came. The people who wanted him to come found a real big piece of beat up, almost unusable land cut in half in Wasco, half in Jefferson County. This is Osho after he came to America. After he got here, his health got a lot better, like fresh air, better diet. So he was willing to stay for a while, see what happened. There were also communes all over the world. We built a lot of infrastructure, built a dam. These big things were carried water from our dam on the John Day, of a creek going to the John Day River to carry water throughout the ranch. We built our own proper houses. We designed these A-frames. People lived in A-frames. And a lot of people lived in those big double-wide trailers, We built a large meditation hall that could hold a whole lot of people. Put in a tremendous amount of dry land farming, irrigated farming. The land that had been really, really deteriorated over years. They called the ranch the Big Muddy, for good reason. It couldn't really grow much. As came out in the land use case, there was very little of the land that was usable, but we created a lot of irrigation, started growing our own vegetarian food. For the festivals, people came from all over the world to be with Osho, to sit with him. Somebody gave Osho a Rolls Royce, and he liked driving around because he couldn't drive in India. He used to drive, but he couldn't drive in India, but it's not possible. So ended up people kept giving him Rolls Royces, and he would drive every day. That's when people would see him. They called it the drive-by. People would line up. Sometimes he'd stop and see people. Here is when he went to the school, our school. If you look at the little blonde girl right behind him with the red hat, that's one of my daughters. Osho basically taught meditation. That's what he was after. He was a meditation teacher. He saw meditation as the way to transform the planet, to move from fear and ambition and greed, desire, to awareness, to compassion. And as he said, meditation is the art of transforming loneliness into aloneness. As he said, meditation is not enough, love is not enough. Both are necessary, and courage is required. He talked about the commune, our way of living, of everybody into their own thing, competition, letting people have not enough food, not have decent education, that sort of thing. He said if we could just move from our head to our heart, from our minds, where all of our fears are, to our heart, where compassion is, to recognize our connection, and that our connection is more powerful than what divides us if we open our hearts. And the commune was a way to live in peace, live in harmony, support the transformation of consciousness, and make our contribution in that way. There were three major areas of cases, all of which you'll hear about: land use and property issues, separation of church and state, and immigration. Before we get into it, I just wanted to say, while we had our fair amount of challenges with politicians and lawyers from around the state and around the country, we sort of became known as the Oregon State Attorneys Full Employment Organization. We had a lot of good lawyers, really good lawyers who helped us in civil and law over the years. One of them is right here, the first one, Judge John Gelderks, who in the face of a lot of hostility stood up for what he believed and what was right. And he was never overturned. Judge Crookham was in the courthouse down the street, and he was a great judge. He always did right down the middle what the law took. Judge Ed Levy, like Mr. Weaver here, was a domer, as we refer to Notre Dame graduates. And Judge Levy was really fair. When people committed crimes, they had to pay for it. But he really protected the rights of the accused. And also, I just want to mention it, we had a lot of copyright cases going, and there was a big copyright case in Los Angeles where I had practiced. And Judge Richard Gadboy is on the federal court there, the trial court. Hell of a guy. I had appeared in front of him for quite a few times before I ended up in a purple suit working for Rice and Dahl. And he was a really good judge who followed the law. So just bear in mind, as we do this thing, that this isn't a panel of experts who are going to share their, the search for truth. These guys are advocates. They were advocates at the time. I assume they're going to be advocates now. I'm an advocate of Osho's position. Because I'm a lawyer, I am not much interested in opinion. I live by evidence. And especially back in the day, and probably still true today, you're not going to believe something just because I tell you. So I have documentary evidence for everything I'm going to present to you. In a sense, you're our jury tonight, even though we're not a jury. But you're going to hear from 3 speakers before I speak. I ask you to keep an open mind and to listen carefully. Listen carefully to the principal points of every person. After they finish, the 3 of them, I'll respond to all of the points. Thank you very much.
I'm John Gelderks. One of the reasons I was looking forward to being here was to see Naren. I hadn't seen him for many, many years, and I saw him many times in the 80s, but always in the courtroom setting, and he was always wearing a very nice suit or sport jacket of some kind, varying shades of red, and was one of the more articulate lawyers that I've ever dealt with in my 47 years as being a trial judge. Tom Balmer, that rings a bell. I was looking through some clippings the other day, and from the Oregonian, March 16th, 1988, it says, Tom Balmer, an attorney representing KGW Channel 8 in Portland, argued before Circuit Judge John Gelderks that the debtor's examination of Ma Anand Sheila should be open to the public. How'd you do on that motion, Tom? Pardon? We did well. You did well, you lost. You. Well, I ruled that depositions ordinarily were not open to the public, and we weren't going to make an exception for Ma Anand Sheila. Prior to 1981, there had been very little litigation in the circuit court generated from the southern part of Wasco County. That all changed in 1981 when the Rajneeshis bought the 64,000-acre ranch, formerly known as the Big Muddy. For the next several years after they purchased the ranch, it seemed like there was always something pending in our court, and I was the only circuit judge in the 3 counties, always something pending involving one or more of the Rajneeshis' entities. The first case I remember was a challenge to the permit that the Wasco County Commissioners had issued to the Rajneeshis to hold their first annual festival out at the ranch. That permit was challenged. I can't remember which group challenged it, but there were groups that challenged most everything. So I heard that case and agreed with the county commissioners, held that the permit was valid, and the first annual festival was held, I think, with quite some success. One of the last things I did was to sign a foreclosure decree turning the ranch over to the lender, who then sold the ranch to a family named Washington, who then made the ranch available to the Young Life organization to have the camps that are being operated there right now. So the land, in a relatively short time, has gone from being a tired ranch, as Naren described it, to an oasis with modern buildings during the time the Rajneeshis were there, in which buildings are now being used by the Young Life camps. What I originally thought, when the Rajneeshis first came, I thought this land might become a religious camp for adults. Well, now it has become a religious camp for junior high and high school students. They now have up to 820 campers out at the ranch every week. Just the other day, I asked a friend who had been to the ranch recently what her first impressions were when she went out to the ranch. She lives in Salem. She offices with me at the federal courthouse. She responded immediately. Her first impressions were, 1, it was incredibly remote. 2, it was spectacularly extravagant. 3, it was organized and welcoming. Most of these same observations would have applied in the mid-'80s when the Rajneeshis were living there. 1, it was incredibly remote. Not everybody realizes how far it is to Rajneeshpuram. From the courthouse in the Dalles, in downtown the Dalles, for example, it took the Wasco County planner a drive of 100 miles to go out and inspect buildings or what was going on at the ranch. The Rajneeshis almost all had registered to vote, which automatically put them up for jury duty. It was a 100-mile drive for the Rajneeshis to drive in from Rajneeshpuram to the Wasco County Courthouse to serve on the juries. If you watch the documentary, toward the end you saw Ma Prem Hasya, H-A-S-Y-A. Hasya had become Bhagwan's personal assistant after Sheila left the ranch. She was a faithful participant in jury service. She was also extremely wealthy. It's a very interesting story as to her background, but I won't go into any of that now. But anyway, she drove her own personal Rolls Royce from Rajneeshpuram to the Wasco County Courthouse, where she drove in on multiple days to serve on the jury. She was probably the best-dressed juror I have ever seen, with about 800 jury trials in my resume. She always wore beautiful designer clothes in varying shades of red. What I've read about her recently was she was a very interesting person with a very interesting background. Also, as I said, extremely wealthy, but a very, very pleasant person. She's since passed away. Number two, as my friend said recently, that it was spectacularly extravagant. Well, I'd say it was spectacularly extravagant when the Rajneeshis lived there. If having 50 Rolls Royces for one man is not extravagant, I don't know what extravagant means. How many at the end? 50-some? 96 Rolls Royces? I lost track somewhere. And the Rajneeshis also had to be extremely well organized to accomplish what they accomplished in such a short time. But as I said, my friend found the camps to be welcoming. Well, I only was at Rajneeshpuram one time, and that was traveling incognito. So I don't know how I would have been welcomed. I think probably pretty well. But if you were perceived as being in the way of what they wanted to do, you would not have felt so welcome. Do you think you would feel welcome if you were one of the 2 Wasco County commissioners who were poisoned while visiting the ranch? Or the county planner and his escort, the deputy sheriff, who drove 100 miles to make an inspection, fully authorized by the planner's position, only to find that the county road had been blocked by a large piece of machinery that the Rajneeshis in charge at that time were not too excited or too helpful in quickly moving it out of the way. Earlier the same morning that I found out about that, somebody had put a police report on my desk, but I had seen Krishnadeva, also known as David Knapp, who was the mayor of Rajneeshpuram and really the public face of the Rajneeshis. He's the one that did a lot of public speaking to Rotary clubs, different service organizations, a very personable guy who was kind of the PR guy. He was actually the only Rajneeshi that I had ever talked with out of the courthouse. I would see him at various events. Well, the same morning, before I had seen the report about the blocking of the road, Krishnadeva was being interviewed on a morning news program. I'll never forget his words. Krishnadeva stood there in front of the TV camera, good-looking guy, always well-dressed in red. And I remember him saying right to my face on the TV screen, "It's time to cut out the crap." That's an exact quote. It's time to cut out the crap. Well, I thought about that day. It was the only time I ever got a little bit agitated in several years of litigation. I'll admit it agitated me because I liked him and enjoyed meeting him from time to time. But if but blocking the road under those circumstances doesn't really fit my definition of, quote, cutting out the crap. I drew up an order that I never filed that I won't share with you unless there's time later, but it would have changed the history of the state of Oregon had I entered the order that I quickly penned out, then had it typed out. Then I called my friend John Copenhaver, a circuit judge over in Bend who covered Deschutes County, older and wiser than I. I read it to him and I said, "John, what do you think?" expecting him to say, "John, just put it in the drawer. Look at it next week." Instead, he said, "John, do what you think you have to do." And I said, "Oh, man, now what do I do?" Well, I put it in the drawer. I'll just skim through a few of the type cases we had over the years. There was a wide variety, and I'm just dealing with what we actually had in our own state circuit court with my being in charge and actually being the judge that handled these. We had challenges both to individual voters and challenges to entire elections. We had actions to enforce the decisions by the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals. The Land Use Board of Appeals had only been created in 1979, and there was very little law in Oregon on how to properly establish a brand new city. This was all new ground for them. I ruled that establishing a city was a land use decision that should be handled by LUBA. LUBA ruled that it was not a land use decision that should be handled by the circuit court. Those went to the Court of Appeals. They concluded and agreed with me that it was a land use decision, so LUBA had to deal with it. But under the state goals established by the Land Conservation and Development Commission, there was an issue over Goal 14 that had to do with farmland, as I recall. Anyway, that case bounced around. I can't say that I ever fully understood it. Between LUBA, the Court of Appeals, LUBA, I can't remember if the Supreme Court got involved. I'm quite sure it did, twice. But I was on the sidelines of all that. My job was just to enforce their final decisions, which I did. When I was asked and if there was a clear ruling, at one point I actually enjoined the Rajneeshis from any further construction period. I can recall saying, "You cannot drive one more nail." And as far as I know, none of the orders that I entered were ever violated by the Rajneeshis, in spite of what people might have been led to believe by at least one of the newspapers. I felt that they respected the court, respected the court's decisions, and didn't violate any of my orders, so I never had to deal with that. There was a lawsuit over who owned the Antelope Church. At one point, I required the city of Antelope to issue building permits to Rajneeshi landowners, which the city of Antelope had refused to issue. Some other rulings regarding the city of Antelope were that the city had the authority to hold an emergency election to disincorporate. The earlier residents of the city wanted to disincorporate, so the Rajneeshis couldn't take over a city, the city of Antelope, if there was no city. I held at one point that the city charter's lengthy residence requirement was invalid under current law, as established by, I think, as high as the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a lengthy residence requirement I held that was invalid. I upheld the county clerk's decision to move the election to rename Antelope to the Dalles. The election was moved. I ruled over objection that she had the authority to do that. The election was held, and even though the election was moved, the Rajneeshi group of voters prevailed, and the city of Antelope was renamed the city of Rajneesh. I can recall only having one jury trial. Naren represented Sheila and one or more of the Rajneeshi organizations. A well-known trial lawyer from the Oregon coast represented the plaintiff, who was a grieving widow who Sheila had maliciously slandered at a public event. The event was filmed. There were a lot of news people there. The event was filmed, and it went out over the television news, a totally false statement that Sheila pointed her finger at the grieving widow all dressed in black and slandered her. Naren could have been the greatest lawyer in the world, but once that jury saw that videotape, they were convinced, and they returned a very substantial verdict against Sheila and one or more of the Rajneesh organizations. In addition to the litigation, I changed dozens of people's names from their given names to their new Rajneesh names. There was very little criminal work for me until the end. There were 2 or 3 other cases, but the serious cases were at the end when I took guilty pleas and sentenced Krishna Deva, Ma Anand Sheila, Diane Onang, and Catherine Elsey. All 3 of those women I just named were convicted of the attempted murder of Dr. Devaraj, a Rajneesh doctor who Sheila thought was getting too close to Bhagwan, and she felt her power slipping away and orchestrated the attempted murder of their own doctor. If you watch the documentary, that was when one of the women stabbed Dr. Devaraj in the butt with a syringe filled with very pure adrenaline, which the medical people said could have killed him. He ended up in the hospital over in Bend. In addition, Sheila and Diane Onang were convicted of poisoning the 2 county commissioners, and Sheila was convicted and sentenced for arson for orchestrating the fire of the Wasco County Planning Commission, an arson fire. In retrospect, I found the cases challenging and interesting and appreciated the very high quality of the legal work from all sides. A number of the best lawyers of the state of Oregon appeared, the top land use lawyers on land use issues, the top election lawyers on election issues. At the end, top criminal lawyers on the criminal issues. The law firm that was out at the ranch, I had never seen it till I saw it on the documentary, but that was the largest law firm east of the mountains in Oregon, with top flight lawyers, with Naren leading the way. The city attorney for the city of Rajneeshpuram, Sangeet, had actually gone to the University of Oregon Law School and had served for a while in the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Portland. I believe it was in the Portland office, as an extern. So she was a known quantity by some of the people that had been around a while. Anyway, even though it was enjoyable and interesting, I'd have to say I wasn't disappointed to see this chapter of my life come to an end. We look forward to some questions after a bit.
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge Justice Balmer and Judge Jeldricks and my other colleagues and ladies and gentlemen who've come to hear us all tonight talk about a very exciting chapter in the history of our state. And I want to particularly commend the Oregon Historical Society as well as the United States District Court Historical Society. This obviously took a lot of work and persuasion in some cases to put together, so I want to commend all of you for that. In 1974, as Naren has explained, in order to accommodate an exponentially growing number of sannyasins, which were what the followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh were called, who had been flocking to his apartment in Mumbai, he formed a foundation and purchased an old military base, British military base in Pune, India, and there established the ashram, the first ashram. It was a place to live with other sannyasins, to meditate, as Naren had says, attend discourses by Bhagwan, take classes, and study a large number of books and records, books and tapes that he had created. But by 1980, about the time Mahanad Sheela became his personal secretary, a decision was made to relocate the ashram. It was too small to accommodate all the sannyasins who wanted to live there, who were coming from all over the world by that time. Moreover, it also was running afoul of the local governments in Pune, and they had undertaken at least the first steps to remove the tax exemption for the ashram. So after failed attempts to find alternate space elsewhere in India, a decision was made to move the ashram, lock, stock, and barrel, to somewhere in the United States. Sheela, whose previous name was Sheela Silverman, and who once attended Montclair State College in New Jersey, became the point person for this move. After first purchasing property in Montclair in the spring of 1981, Sheela made a whirlwind trip through the western states, and in June of that year, as has been described here by both Judge Jeldricks and Naren, arranged for the foundation to purchase the Big Muddy Ranch, a 64,000-acre ranch in both Wasco and Jefferson counties that backed onto the John Day River Canyon. It was renamed Rancho Rajneesh, and the Rajneeshis, which the sannyasins were also known as, immediately set into place a plan to build a city on that ranch to be named Rajneeshpuram. It would serve as the silver city on the hill for the thousands of Rajneeshis around the world. It would have housing up to 10 or 15,000, a hotel, a gigantic lecture hall, dining facilities. You've seen some of the pictures here. Infrastructure that was very detailed. It included a landing strip and, as will be addressed by Bill Gary, a municipal government. So as you might imagine, this was a pretty big undertaking, and it was planned and executed in secrecy. It meant moving from the Pune ashram to this remote property in Central Oregon, hundreds, then thousands of people, most with no permanent U.S. resident status or even visas to come here in the first place. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, jewelry, and precious metals, tens of thousands of books, files, tapes, tools, household pictures, clothing, everything from the Rolls Royce, the first Rolls Royce, to the knives, forks, and spoons. It also created, for the Rajneeshis, the three significant challenges that Naren outlined earlier, only one of which I believe they ever anticipated. And that was the one that fell to me. To get all these people and materials into the United States necessitated a massive fraud against the United States Customs Service and the United States Immigration Service. It entailed smuggling, swearing to false import declarations, fraudulently obtained visas, including Bhagwan's, who claimed he needed to visit the United States temporarily only for back surgery, and then he would return, surgery he never got, and hundreds of fraudulent marriages between American sannyasins and non-American sannyasins, all done to get the non-Americans green cards. Get green cards for those foreign-born spouses, and all done despite the fact that one of Bhagwan's principal tenets was that traditional marriage was a worthless and self-limiting institution. This was the one legal obstacle, as I say, I think they anticipated, the one that fell the United States Attorney's Office to deal with. And in those days, I was criminal chief, all at 31 years old. And it was for me in those days to be the gatekeeper of what the U.S. Attorney's Office was going to take on to prosecute and what we weren't. And for the first couple of years, I declined every one of these cases that was brought to me by the Immigration Service. The Immigration Service has administrative authority to deport anybody that they think has overstayed their visa or is here illegally. They have adequate authority apart from the U.S. Attorney's Office prosecution hammer to deal with those problems, but by 1983 this got so darn big that we had to act. That was number one. Not anticipated were the lawsuit brought by the Attorney General, the Oregon Attorney General, particularly in the person of Bill Gary, challenging the incorporation of the city Rajneeshpuram on the ranch, Rancho Rajneesh, on the basis of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And then the third was a 5-year legal battle under what Judge Jeldricks described as the relatively new Oregon land use law, which before it was all over entailed 8 different LUBA decisions, 10 Oregon Court of Appeals decisions, my notes say 5 Oregon Supreme Court decisions, a charge that the Rajneeshis bribed a Wasco County official to obtain initial incorporation of that city in the first place, taking over the small town of Antelope and renaming it Rajneesh as a backup, fallback option, persistent clashes with the Wasco County planning and building authorities that in the fall of 1984 led to the Rajneeshis busing to the ranch over 2,000 homeless people from all over the United States and trying to register them to vote in Wasco County and thereby take over the Wasco County government and make all those problems disappear. And when that failed, poisoning restaurant salad bars in the Dalles with salmonella bacteria in order to render longtime residents too sick to show up on the day of the election. So what may have started out innocently in the 1970s had turned into a criminal enterprise by the time that Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh arrived on his Wasco County ranch in August of 1981. Now, tonight others have and will continue to speak to a number of these issues, and I've been asked to address the federal government's response to them, to the federal aspect of it, primarily but not exclusively the immigration case, because there was quite a twist in this investigation at its end. As Michael Cohen recently has reminded us all, and Martha Stewart before him, every knowingly false statement made to a United States law enforcement officer is a 5-year felony. That would include Bhagwan's lies to the U.S. consular officials in India to get his temporary health-related visa in '81, when in fact he had no intention of having that surgery or leaving the United States after he got here. Lies by dozens of Rajneeshis to obtain the temporary travel visas that they needed about the same time to come to the ranch to help build this new city, get it started, who also had no intention of ever leaving. Hundreds of fraudulent marriages that occurred throughout the country from '81 to '85 to obtain permanent resident status, green cards for the non-resident sannyasis. False United States customs declarations to smuggle over 90 crates of Bhagwan's personal possessions and ashram materials into the United States for eventual delivery to the ranch. Now you might think, given how broad this was, comprehensive, maybe brazen, that this would be easy to investigate and put together and prosecute. It was anything but, for a number of reasons. The Immigration Service, which is now a part of ICE, was then a separate unit of the United States Department of Justice, but it then enjoyed the same reputation that it does today. The Immigration Service is not the FBI. Green card files, we would learn, were a mess. These green card applications were made all over the United States. They were a mess. They were misfiled. Original documents, which were necessary for admissibility in court, were missing. Sannyasins had taken on Rajneeshi names, as Judge Jeldricks pointed out, at the ranch, but when they went off to get married, one to the other, they temporarily returned to their given names until such time as they passed the immigration test in whatever town they happened to be at the time, and then they hightailed it back to the ranch and returned to their sannyasin names. That made it difficult. We had what I would call legal distractions from Naren. Numerous FOIA requests filed by his legal team to discover, we believe, the details of our investigation, which would otherwise be entitled to secrecy. Then there was this federal lawsuit seeking a court order forcing the Immigration Service to approve green card applications that we suspected to be fraudulent. There would be discovery attendant to that we did not want to participate in because we believed it was primarily not just to get the green cards, but to find out what the U.S. Attorney's Office is up to and whether there's a grand jury investigation going on and whether witnesses have been called and what their names are. Key witnesses, including those who had left the ranch, were difficult to find and then persuade to cooperate, even including those humiliated and banished by Sheila. Many were still suffering the effects of isolation on that ranch. There was very little communication in and out of that ranch. This was pre-internet, pre-cell phone, and there was very limited newspaper coverage or access to news on that ranch by most of the people who lived and worked there. Bhagwan and Sheila met, just the two of them, nearly every day and were careful who to include in their planning. Sometimes it was just the two of them. Bhagwan was continually testing the immigration process to obtain that green card that he wanted. When one thing failed, he tried another, health reasons. Then he wanted religious leader status, which he may, I think, have finally gotten, but it didn't give him the permanent resident status that he wanted. So in February 1984, he claimed permanent resident status on the ground that he had been adopted at age 5 in 1936 by Ma Anand, Sheila's father. And this was more serious. This is a more serious dilemma that we faced because the State of Oregon Bureau of Police Standards and Training certified the Rajneeshpuram Police Peace Force as a legitimate licensed Oregon Police Department. It was permitted to have the same kind of weaponry that the Portland Police Bureau has, the Oregon State Police have, that included semi-automatic weapons, tear gas, stun grenades, all of that. And we had to assume that if we ever needed to go on that ranch to execute any kind of warrant at all, those officers would not be loyal to their badge. They'd be loyal to Bhagwan. And to drive that point home, Sheila, in front of a dozen local TV news cameras, frequently arranged for television news coverage of the Uzi training on the ranch and frequently made threats of violence against government authorities and civilians or anybody who got in her way. And then in September of 1985, after 2 years of this federal grand jury investigation that we were conducting in secret, as grand jury investigations are conducted, just weeks before we were to return the immigration indictment against Bhagwan, Sheila, and several other sannyasins, Sheila and some of those same targets fled the ranch and went to Germany. That was a real big problem. She took up residence in a German village 40 miles from the Swiss border, and once she crossed it, she would never be extraditable. She wouldn't because she enjoyed dual citizenship in Switzerland due to a previous marriage to a Swiss citizen who was now deceased. And even though the case occurred, as I mentioned, during those pre-internet cell phone days, if she got wind that the warrants were being executed on the ranch, she would hightail it into Switzerland and we'd never get her again. Yet if we encountered armed resistance On the ranch, when we attempted to arrest Bhagwan and the defendants who still remained on the ranch, we risked not getting him and not getting her. Both. We would have lost them both. Then, unwittingly, I believe, Bhagwan came to our aid. In October 1985 is when this occurred. We were just wrapping up this immigration investigation. And since arriving at the ranch in 1981, he stopped speaking in public altogether. But after Sheila left, he broke that silence, took the stage, and before a dozen or so television cameras, he denounced Sheila and revealed a host of more serious crimes she and her inner circle had committed, which he claimed he had just now learned about. They included things that you've already heard about: the attempted murder of Devaraj, the doctor, the arson of the Wasco County Planning Agency office, illegal wiretapping of visitors to the ranch. Everybody in that hotel, if anybody was thought to be an important person, politician, or newspaper person, their rooms were bugged, their telephone calls were bugged. The salmonella poisoning was another one. Now, these were all things that we did not really know about before Bhagwan shared them with us. And then this brought to the ranch the FBI, the Oregon State Police, the Wasco County Sheriff's Office, all onto the ranch to investigate all these crimes, far more serious than immigration fraud. Now, I don't know what he had in mind when he opened this Pandora's box, but he quickly tired of the heavy law enforcement presence on that ranch and instructed his followers not to cooperate any further with the police agencies that were there. Those investigations continued nonetheless, and late in October '85, we finally returned a 35-count indictment of Rajneesh, Sheila, 6 others on the immigration fraud case, and put a plan into place to execute simultaneous arrests on the ranch and in Germany. Now, at the time, it was the largest immigration fraud case in the history of the United States. 400. It included this visa application that Rajneesh got while he was still in India, and there were 400 fraudulent marriages, and we stopped there, and we could have kept going and going and going. Bhagwan got wind of it shortly before the warrants were to be executed. And if you've seen the Netflix documentary, you know what happened. He got wind of it shortly before the warrants were to be executed on the ranch, and with a handful of household help and close advisors, he fled the ranch one Sunday evening in 2 Learjets, heading for Bermuda, a place from which he could not be extradited because that is not a crime for which extradition in Bermuda is recognized. And if you viewed the Netflix series, I think you know all the rest. He, along with all the passengers on those 2 jets, were arrested at midnight, refueling in Charlotte and ready to head to Bermuda. My agent, Joe Green, and I flew to Charlotte the next day, and after a two-day bail hearing, Bhagwan was ordered to be returned to Portland for trial in the custody of the United States Marshals. Within a few weeks after he returned, he pleaded guilty to 2 felonies, paid a fine of $400,000, withdrew his green card application, promised he would never renew it. He agreed to leave the United States immediately and never returned. Following that, a number of people were charged and convicted of those other offenses we first learned about from Bhagwan. Assistant U.S. Attorney Barry Sheldall investigated and charged the Salmonella case, which I still believe holds the record as being the largest domestic bioterrorism case in United States history. The arson and attempted murder cases were prosecuted locally, presided over by Judge Jeldricks. Judge Levy was then on the federal district court, presided over all the federal cases. Sheila was arrested, as it turned out, before she got to Switzerland, and she and Pooja, the nurse, and Shanti Bharatra, the shooter, pleaded guilty to several state and federal charges and served a 4.5-year prison term. Now, when they went to the ranch, the FBI investigated not just those things that Bhagwan initially told us about, but uncovered far more additional, far more serious crimes, including, strikingly, the attempt to murder my boss, Charles Turner, the United States Attorney for the District of Oregon, the top law enforcement officer in this state appointed by President Reagan. That remained under investigation, but Sheila was arrested before she could escape, brought back here with those others that I mentioned, pleaded guilty to several state and federal charges, and served a 4.5-year prison term. During the next several years, the remaining defendants were also eventually apprehended at various places throughout the world, brought back here and prosecuted. Bhagwan, for his part, was driven straight to PDX after his guilty plea. That was our side of the deal, and flew out of the United States for good. After being denied entry by a number of other countries, he settled eventually in Paraguay for the next several years before returning to India. Within a few months of his departure, the ranch went into foreclosure, from which it was sold to a cattle rancher who then has donated it to this youth group. Antelope was finally restored to many of its longtime residents. Rajneeshpuram and Rancho Rajneesh were all gone. And for all practical purposes, this most scintillating, exciting, dangerous, all-captivating event in the first half of the 1980s in the history of this state came to a screeching halt. Now, there were two people, for the record, that I would like to simply acknowledge for their extraordinary effort and bravery, frankly. One was my trial partner, Bill Youngman, Assistant U.S. Attorney, who was with me step for step through this, and the other was Joe Green, who was dispatched from the National Office of the Immigration Service. He did turn out to be FBI quality. He was an outstanding guy and an outstanding agent and one of the finest law enforcement officers that I ever worked with. So, a couple things in conclusion. These are facts, these are not opinions, but I want to give you now, since Naren had made reference to evidence, I will tell you that one of the first things I tell all my clients, whether I was in the government or in private practice, is we trial lawyers don't live in the world of what happened. We live in the world of what can be proven. And if the evidence isn't there on the other side, we don't have anything to worry about. And if we can't generate evidence on our side, we have a lot to worry about. What I've recited here are fact, but I want to give you two thoughts as I leave here, at least for this part of it. And it's really to acknowledge, I've been asked 1,000 times, why weren't shots fired? Were you ever worried that the people in Eastern Oregon were going to rise up and that there was going to be a bloodbath on the ranch? And I think despite heightened rhetoric on both sides and no shortage of armament on all sides, this resolution came to pass without a shot ever being fired, and to that I credit an enormous measure of patience and trust that Oregonians had in their government, in their law enforcement officers, in their prosecutors, and in the judges who presided over these affairs. Additional credit, I think, is, and I know this to be true because I was on so many phone calls with them, the Oregon congressional delegation were under a lot of pressure. Their members were under a lot of pressure to do something, and they gave us the time to do our job. They showed great restraint, and they are to be commended. And finally, I want to commend an unnamed fueler on the tarmac of the Salt Lake City Airport. When he took off that night, Bhagwan, we weren't sure he was on the plane, either one of those planes. My agents had informants. Those informants thought they saw him, but they weren't sure. We didn't know. And neither plane filed initially flight plans, and we didn't know where they were going. As it turned out, they refueled after they left the ranch, one in Pueblo, Colorado, the other in Salt Lake City, and the guy who refueled the plane in Salt Lake, the fueler there, told us that, yeah, he got a glimpse of the Bhagwan, identified him on the airplane, and told us they were all heading to Charlotte. So, but for that guy, this whole story may have been entirely different. So, thanks to him, thanks to you.
Evening. You know, I think the question that I get asked the most since the documentary came out is, what was the story with those big glasses that you wore back then? I am a lawyer, as is Bob and Naren. I'm not here to relitigate 35-year-old cases, but in the spirit of the Oregon Historical Society and the United States District Court Historical Society, to share the experience and hopefully provide some insight into this incredibly interesting period of Oregon history. The Attorney General and the Oregon Department of Justice had three distinct responsibilities as the saga of the Rajneesh in Oregon unfolded. It was a saga that unfolded only over about 4.5 years. First, we were legal counsel to all state agencies, and we were responsible for advising them with respect to their dealings with the Rajneesh community and with the city of Rajneeshpuram once it came to be. That included clients as diverse as the Secretary of State on election law issues, the Superintendent of Public Instruction on public education matters, the Land Conservation and Development Commission on land use matters, and more agencies than you probably even can imagine exist. It's really quite a lesson to learn how much the state of Oregon interfaces with and interacts with local governments like the city of Rajneeshpuram. Second, as relationships with the Rajneesh community began to deteriorate, and you've heard from Judge Gelderks about the large number of cases that were born out of that community, it fell to us as the Department of Justice to represent the state in all of that litigation. And finally, we had the prosecutorial responsibility to enforce Oregon law. Each of these responsibilities carried their own unique challenges, but by late 1983, all three of these different pots were cooking at a full boil. In just a few short years, the Rajneesh community went from being a utopian experiment barely noticed outside of Central Oregon to a national phenomena presenting cutting-edge legal issues at every turn and playing out in the hot gleam of the Klieg lights and cameras. And inevitably and ultimately, it became what I think is probably the most sweeping criminal enterprise in the history of the state of Oregon. Large-scale immigration fraud that you've heard of, the arson, burning of the Wasco County Planning Office to the ground, massive illegal surveillance, not only of visitors, but also of commune residents, poisoning 750 people in the Dalles, poisoning the Jefferson County District Attorney, Mike Sullivan, and Assistant Attorney General, and two county commissioners, as you heard, and the attempted murder of the Bhagwan's personal physician, the attempted assassination of U.S. Attorney Charles Turner, and a plot to assassinate Attorney General Dave Frohnmeyer. So how did this grand experiment spin out of control so completely in such a relatively short period of time? I think it's fairly clear that the corruption started at the top. By the height of the city of Rajneeshpuram, there were thousands of good-hearted, good people who were seeking nothing more than spiritual enlightenment and fulfillment. But the commune's leader, Mahanad Sheila, and her associates wielded absolute power within the commune, unbound by secular laws and unbound by settled societal norms. They convinced the Bhagwan's followers that they were doing whatever was necessary for the commune to survive. They created an other for Rajneeshis to fear and despise, and that other was anyone who stood in the way of what they sought to accomplish. Neighbors, public officials, the media, anyone who challenged their authority or their motivations. One of the things that enabled Sheila and her associates to wield such power is that between May of 1982 and September of 1985, Sheila functioned as an absolute dictator. She was the sole source of religious authority because Bhagwan had taken a vow of silence, and she spoke for him, and she commanded all of the levers of secular power through the city of Rajneeshpuram, one of the few theocracies in the history of America. That merger of secular and ecclesiastical authority is where I'd like to focus my remarks this evening. Now, the framers of the United States Constitution recognized that there are two equally essential elements to religious liberty. The liberty of conscience that empowers each of us to subscribe to and practice religious beliefs, or not, as we see fit. That's the Free Exercise Clause. And the principle that the institutions of government should be separate from the institutions of religion, and that government should observe strict neutrality in the face of the diverse religious beliefs of its people. That's the Establishment Clause. These elements are complementary. They are not in conflict. There are religions today, as you all know, that teach that government power and religious authority should be one and the same. But the religion clauses of our Constitution flatly reject that model, and for good reason. There can be no free exercise right for a church to exercise government power. And no matter how extreme or outside the mainstream one's religious beliefs may be, there can be no justification for the government to criminalize or punish those beliefs. The law, as complex and as befuddling as the Free Exercise and Establishment Clause cases can be, and they are fairly difficult to decipher, the core concept of the religion clauses is really pretty simple. The institutions of government and the institutions of religion should be separate, and neither should control the other. The lawlessness that infected and ultimately destroyed the Rajneesh commune flourished in part because of the merger of ecclesiastical and secular power in the city of Rajneeshpuram. Beginning in 1981, several thousand Rajneeshi sannyasins
as you've heard, worked tirelessly to turn that overgrazed 64,000-acre ranch in Central Oregon into a model religious community. You've also heard a little bit about how Oregon's land use laws generally seek to concentrate population density in urban areas around incorporated cities in order to preserve agricultural land for agricultural purposes. The commune was in the middle of agricultural land. It wasn't very good agricultural land, or at least had fallen into disuse. But as the commune grew, so too did its land use problems. It became increasingly difficult to characterize the development on the commune as agriculturally related. It was an inevitable and altogether sensible step for the commune to contemplate incorporating as a city. On December 31st, 1981, that was after the Wasco County Commission had called for an election to determine whether the city should be incorporated, and before the vote took place. On that date, according to the city's comprehensive, three things happened on that date that really put the future city of Rajneeshpuram on a collision course with the Establishment Clause. First, Rajneesh Neosanyas International Commune was created as a religious cooperative corporation. According to the city's comprehensive plan and the commune's articles of incorporation, the commune was to be, quote, a religious community whose life is, in every respect, to be guided by the teachings of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and whose members live in a communal life with a common treasury. Only members of the Rajneesh religion could be members of the commune, and the commune board had absolute power to invite others to join in the life of the commune as visitors or as guests. Second, the religious foundation that you heard about that owned all of the 64,000-acre ranch leased it to the commune for a term of 21 years with options to renew for 2 additional 21-year terms. And finally, the foundation created Rajneesh Investment Corporation, which was a for-profit corporation, and transferred to it the ownership of Rancho Rajneesh, subject to the commune lease that had just been executed, in exchange for 100% of the investment corporation's stock. So before the city of Rajneeshpuram was incorporated as a city, a religious commune controlled all of the land in and around the future city, except for the county road which ran through the ranch, and it had the right to continue that control for 63 years. The commune controlled who could live on the ranch and who could be invited to visit. It was required by the terms of the lease to lease back to the foundation all or any portion of the ranch at any time for religious purposes. In May 1982, the members of the commune living on the ranch voted unanimously to incorporate the city of Rajneeshpuram. Subsequently, they elected a mayor and 4 city councilors, also unanimously. From the outset of the city of Rajneeshpuram, the Attorney General and the Department of Justice began to field a wide range of legal questions about how state agencies were supposed to deal with the city. Is the city entitled to receive revenue sharing from alcohol, tobacco, and gasoline taxes? Oregon has a very strict provision in its own Constitution, Article 1, Section 5, that prohibits any financial aid to a religion. Given the close relationship between the commune, the religious entity and the city, did the state need to take any particular steps to protect against a violation of that constitutional provision? Are members of the Peace Force entitled to Board on Police Standards and Training and certification? Were they entitled to be a police force? As you heard, the answer to that question, at least initially, was yes. I don't think Bob's ever forgiven me for that one. And related to that is the police peace force in Rajneeshpuram entitled to have access to criminal intelligence databases. Can uninvited visitors who leave the county road be arrested for trespass if they come to the city? And if they can, how can a reporter from the Oregonian go to City Hall in order to request public records of the city? Questions like these arose on an almost daily basis, and the Department of Justice lawyers tried to address them on a case-by-case basis. As with everything that we did in advising state government, our goal was to get it right, but if we couldn't get it right, at least the advice that we gave should be consistent, principled, and well-reasoned. But the more that we dealt with the unique situation of Rajneeshpuram, the more uncomfortable we became with the way that every one of those interactions that I described and a host of others seemed to put the state in a situation that fostered an excessive government entanglement with religion. It required us to think about people's motivations and to probe into the inner workings of the religion as well as the city. The common ownership and control of all property in and around the city of Rajneeshpuram by religious organizations and the overarching commitment of the community to be guided by the teachings of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh made it virtually impossible to distinguish between the acts of government and the acts of the church. We kept coming up against what seemed like an insurmountable structural problem with the interrelationship between the institutions of religion and the institutions of government. Gotcha. So we recognized at the time that we were exploring new territory, and we knew that a conclusion that the very incorporation of the city of Rajneeshpuram violated the Establishment Clause was a potentially incendiary decision and would have far-reaching consequences. So we went out and got expert help. We retained Larry Tribe, constitutional law professor at Harvard, author of the seminal treatise on American constitutional law, and Dean Jesse Choper from Bolt Hall, another noted national constitutional scholar. Those professors thought that the answer was actually fairly simple. It was based on a case called Larkin versus Grendel's Den, which said no matter whether the exercise of government power is wielded properly or not, the exercise of government power by a religion is not permitted under the Constitution. And in Rajneeshpuram, the interconnection between the foundation, its wholly created investment company, the commune, and the city effectively put all of the city's government powers into the hands of the church. Now, we issued our opinion, and because we knew that this was not a small matter, we also announced that we would initiate litigation to seek guidance from the court and get a determination as to the constitutionality of the incorporation of the city. We knew that we were in for a fight because, as you've heard, the Rajneeshis had the largest law firm east of the mountains, very talented and able lawyers, led by Naren, and they had the wherewithal to obtain the expert advice that they would need for the fight. What we didn't anticipate was the depth of the reaction from the leaders of the commune. The Attorney General became public enemy number one almost immediately. As the litigation progressed, the bottom fell out of the bag in Rajneeshpuram, as you've heard. And one by one, leaders of the city began to negotiate plea agreements. You heard about Swami Krishnadeva, the mayor. He pled guilty, and one of the conditions of his guilty plea was that he would cooperate with the Attorney General with respect to the church-state lawsuit. Eventually, Sheila also pled guilty, and she ultimately confirmed everything that we heard from Krishnadeva, which was that it wasn't just a structural problem. In fact, Sheila controlled everything. She turned around in a car one day and said to Krishnadeva, "You're going to be the mayor." And every decision was made by Mahanad Sheila with respect to the city. On December 10th, 1985, Judge Fry heard oral argument on cross motions for summary judgment, and she ruled from the bench that the incorporation of the city of Rajneeshpuram was a violation of the Establishment Clause. By then, as I said, things were already disintegrating at the commune, and so it was a little bit of a too little, too late, perhaps. But that's the story of how the state versus the city of Rajneeshpuram came to be. Thank you.
Now every speaker, including Judge Gelders, has gone over, and I had promised Naren that he could have as much time as, not Judge Gelders, but as Mr. Gary and Mr. Weaver had. So Prem, come on up, Naren, and I would ask Naren, if he can, to maybe keep this to half an hour, and then I will, to the extent that we can, extend this, the 9 o'clock cutoff date. I know some people are tired, but those of you who are as engaged with this as I am, it's just, it's fascinating stuff that you're not going to hear anywhere else. So I would encourage you to stay, and we will let Naren speak for at least half an hour. But I also would like to get some discussion going, but I have some interesting questions that I'd like to ask, and we will continue this beyond 9 o'clock for those of you who are willing to stay. Naren, I apologize for not giving you as much time as you probably should get, but why don't you start right now and see what we can do in half an hour.
I'm going to need a bit more than half an hour.
Okay.
They took almost an hour and a half. And I can't just say things. The people here don't want to hear me just say things. I have evidence to show you. You're already tired, in overload with hearing all of this stuff. But can somebody help me to just plug this in, please? Thanks. Yeah. Thank you very much. Let's see if this is actually going to come up. When I started practicing law in 1972, there was no such thing as computers except for the government. If anybody wants to, you can stand up, take a couple of breaths, whatever you need to try and get present to this. I see some people have already left. I had wanted to address each of the issues, major issues, after they were addressed, but I was not allowed to do that, so this is what we got. I'm going to first talk about land use, then I'm going to talk about immigration, then I'm going to talk about the church and state case. I'm going to spend more time on immigration than anything else because that was eventually how they got rid of Osho in the community. I'm going to be much more brief when it comes to land use. There were two real aspects of land use. One was about the city of Antelope, us buying property and using it there. And the other was about the city of Rajneeshpuram, having an urban growth boundary on what had been agricultural land and the application of Rule 14. In 1980, the city of Antelope had a population of 39 people, most of which had only lived there a few years. Since 1970, it had been described as a ghost town. After we bought a property, we were told by a group called 1,000 Friends of Oregon that if you try and do urban uses on the ranch, we're going to sue you. You got to go to Antelope. So we said, okay, we'll try and go to Antelope. We were trying to get along. We bought that property in the middle of essentially the geographic center of nowhere so we'd be a distance. We wanted to develop our community based on meditation and self-acceptance, community built on working together, somewhere distant, which is why we had picked that property, which is why that property picked, for its very remoteness. In any event, as soon as we bought property in the city of Antelope, there were only 39 people who lived there. Most of the property was for sale. We paid the asking price. We bought property. As soon as we bought property and tried to get business licenses to use it, the city of Antelope decided they denied all those business licenses. Thank God for Judge Geldricks on that and a number of other decisions. He said, you can't do that. You've got to follow the law. So we were able to buy property there and use it. The 1,000 Friends said, Antelope is committed to providing essential facilities and we may not rely on the hostility of Antelope residents to excuse developing there. But then when we tried to develop there, they tried to stop us. So what became known as the invasion of Antelope was a conspiracy to buy property for the asking price and to use it. That's pretty insidious, isn't it? There was a great deal of hostility. The Antelope tried to disincorporate, kill itself legally, so that we couldn't use the property there. So then we had to move people in. We had to move people in so they could vote, so we could use our own property. It was all legal. So it was purchase of property, assembly, and conspiracy to vote. 1,000 Friends of Oregon got behind the effort to stop us on land use issues. After they had told us we had to go to Antelope, they went and represented Antelope to stop us from using our property there. They were extremely hostile to the organization. They didn't just want to stop the land use, they wanted to destroy the city. One of the people said Mark Greenfield said on television that they wanted the city declared null and void, the election null and void. There's no city council, no Rajneeshpuram. One of the 1,000 Friends attorneys, after they lost, said, it doesn't matter that we lost because they're unconstitutional. So they didn't really care what rubric it took as long as we got stopped. Just touching, I need to, we talk about the law as if it's his ivory tower, and the law is important because the law is what's, even though it's often controlled by the powerful for the powerful, to some extent. It's also, to some extent, to protect people. That's what laws are for. But when public opinion gets very, very strong, and when the government itself becomes involved in the persecution or prosecution of people, which certainly we're all familiar with the South for a long, long period of time, and gender discrimination, all sorts of stuff, you know, it really steers the ship of the law. Judges have the job of righting the ship, and they try to do that, hopefully with success. But people talk about, you know, we were, after a while, the state came against us. The fact is, it was from the beginning. From the time we bought that property, within months, there was a big controversy, and they wanted us out of there. Governor Atiyah, and I always find this interesting because his parents were from Syria, you know, rug merchants, and neighbors probably didn't like them too much when they first came. Said that if your neighbors don't, in the press, he said, if your neighbors don't like you, you should move. So we should give up the purchase of this $64,000 acre ranch, which is 26 miles from the nearest town, which is Antelope, with 38 residents, because people don't like us. Interesting approach towards the civil rights. Bob Davis, who some of you may remember, because he was the executive assistant to Tom McCall, the late great governor of this state, although it was misspelled in the press. I don't know why the Ben Bulletin couldn't get it right. It was Tom McCall, not Tom McCoy. He said, what it really boils down to is that the people of Oregon are saying, we don't want you in Antelope. We don't want you on the ranch. We don't want you in Oregon. We don't want you in the United States. And that was how it was. One of the lawyers who really helped us for a long time was a great lawyer named Ed Sullivan. Was a land use expert and really helped us over years. Really a fine man and a fine lawyer. And he said in an article that he wrote years later, the fact is that there was no alternative open to them if they were going to keep their commercial and industrial and residential uses in order to make the ranch a success. We had to it. And again, for land use, just get something here, simple. All we were looking at incorporating and having urban uses was like maybe 2% of the land of the ranch. It was a few acres in the middle of the ranch, which was going to have urban type uses. The rest of the ranch would still be the ranch. Just to touch, you know, I have tons more stuff I could share you, and I'm trying to get through this because I'm afraid the justice will gavel me, and also just to try and stay within your range of possible energy. But, you know, the Oregonian, a couple of years later, took credit for helping drive us out of the state. The Oregonian, in an ad, took credit for helping drive us out of the state with their so-called journalism. Just to give you some context of how this whole thing played out, as of 1983, there were 65 land use votes by these different bodies, courts, agencies, 65 votes by 1983, mid-83 when this article was written. By 86, it was probably double that. Just to give you some idea of this community, trying to develop a community, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on attorneys to fight for their survival. There were petitions filed to dissolve the city. There was a statute, a law passed by the state of Oregon, specifically directed to prevent cities like ours. We were the only one. It was the only one the statute would apply to. Again, on the land use level, LCDC, Conservation Development Commission, adopted a retroactive temporary rule. And that retroactive temporary rule was specifically directed to our community, saying you had to comply by certain rules and regulations, but it was only directed toward us. Temporary, never applied before, never applied again. And what for? The Oregon Court of Appeals, in one of their decisions, noted as a factual basis that the lands are not suitable for farm use. The marginal quality of the land, overgrazed condition, and the difficulty of restoring it to limited productivity prevented it from requiring us to address those land use goals. Finally, in 1985, the Supreme Court held that, yes, we were entitled to incorporate. People were entitled to incorporate. And land use issues would have to come after that. At the end of the 7 years, the Supreme Court again decided that you had to apply the land, even applying the land use goals, there was simply not sufficient value agriculturally to the land, that little piece we wanted to take, which was the least, some of the least useful land, to support the land use challenge by Thousand Friends of Oregon, which they had required us to spend hundreds and thousands of dollars and many years to fight. I'm going to move to immigration. In 81, OSHA was having increasing medical problems. He had asthma, he had diabetes, he had a very bad back problem. And he had had treatment for several years. And it was concurrently with that, Sheila already wanted to, Lakshmi had been in charge, a woman named Lakshmi, nice lady. I knew her a little. But then she was trying to find land around India. That had been going on for a couple of years. So she was gone. Sheila took over her job after Lakshmi was gone. Sheila, because she had a green card and had married an American guy, a banker named John Shelfer, Swami Jayananda, they really wanted to get Osho to come to the United States. They thought they could get a big piece of land, we could get away from some of the problems. So, as people do, they talked to him and said, if we can get this together, would you come? Now, you got to understand something. Even though whatever Osho said or didn't say, and there's been no evidence offered to you, I will address that more later. Sheila may well have had the intent for Osho to stay, but Osho had serious medical problems. There were also communes, new communes around the world, several in Europe and in other areas. Now, Osho had an experience where they call it a failure of micturition. That is a pressure on a spinal cord. He couldn't pee, which unfortunately is a problem I have the reverse of since I had prostate cancer. And when that happened, it can be dangerous. So they decided, okay, now we got to do something about it. So they got letters from the doctors, and Sheila went into Mumbai and met with a woman named Joyce Smith, who was the head of dealing with those sorts of issues in Mumbai for the U.S. Consular Service, and talked to her about it. And there's no evidence to the contrary that Joyce Smith apparently said, you can get a medical visa, and then once you're there, you can apply for adjustment of status. It's legal to do that. If you try and deal with him being a religious teacher now, it will take months to get through that, and that won't help you with his medical problems. So Sheila said, okay. And there's testimony to support that that's what happened. So she got all this medical information together, and the visa was issued, and he came to the United States in June 1, 1981. Here's a letter, just to show you, here's a letter from Dr. Hardekar was a fairly important, he was a treating physician and an orthopedic surgeon, and he said to us that he's advised that we rush him to the United States for further treatment. Not for surgery per se, but to be in the United States or someplace safe, could have been Europe, where if surgery had to happen, it could be done safely. So Osho came to the United States, and then in November that same year, 1981, there was a young disciple, sannyasin, who was an immigration attorney from Houston, and he went in and talked to Sheila and Jay and said, if you want him to stay, you should make an application now, because right now the visa categories are open for India, might not be next year, so a decision was made to apply for status visa as a religious teacher and to change status in the United States. It's called adjustment of status. And that application was filed on November 21, 1981. I want to go back and talk just a little bit about what the government was doing. The immigration fraud investigation began in 1981 in October, before Osho even applied for permanent residence. It was opened after Ed Meese, responding to a letter from a constituent, sent memos, not personally, but through his people, sent memos to the INS and the IRS saying, take a look at this guy. 1 month after the investigation started, Tom Casey, who was the lead investigator, said, subject does not appear amenable to this service, any action at this time. What does that mean? It means we don't have any evidence that anything wrong happened. But he gives his opinion. In my opinion, he and his associates are opportunistic charlatans deriving a handsome income from his disciples. Even-handed, huh? No bias there whatsoever, right? It was from the beginning, all he wanted to do was find something to get us out. He also said, we're evaluating his teachings, which is a per se constitutional intrusion on freedom of religion and freedom of speech. You just can't do that. What do you have to do? Oh, there was another memo. There was a memo from a regional commissioner said, perhaps this is wishful thinking, but there is speculation that the pressure applied by the service to the immigration situation may cause them to pick up stakes and leave. So does this sound like an even-handed investigation for you? They just wanted to put pressure in any way they could. Senator Hatfield, the late, well-loved Senator Hatfield, responding to his constituents, was very strong with the INS saying, you've got to do something about this guy. The INS later produced a memo saying the senator is very concerned about the operation of this religious cult, which Senator Hatfield believes is endangering the way of life for a small agricultural town in Oregon. Buying property, dangerous. Another memo came out saying from the INS district director, any information to discredit the foundation, please advise. All they wanted was finding some way to discredit the organization. They weren't looking for evidence in any sort of fair way. In 1982, the visa petition and application for adjustment were denied. The principal grounds wasn't a religion, couldn't perform the duties because he was in silence and ill, and he had a preconceived intent to remain in the United States. Let's first address physical vitality. They said he couldn't, during his period of self-imposed silence, he had not been engaged in a religious service. Silence has been a religious practice, a spiritual practice, since Buddha, since Jesus. How many monastic orders are there where silence is considered a deeply religious practice, not to mention all the Eastern religions? They denied the application for justice's status on a discretionary basis. They said there are no countervailing factors in the case. The fact that Osho was a recognized world teacher and leader, not a factor. The fact that the people around him had spent almost $60 million in Oregon and New Jersey, not a factor. And most of that money was spent on Oregon businesses for equipment and double wides, that sort of thing. So, under the Constitution, one of the decisions said it could be argued that the beneficiary does not teach religion, rather the antipathy of religion. I don't think that's an appropriate word of that use of that word, but I certainly know what he meant. Not the kind of religion intended by the regulation. That's flatly inconsistent with the constitutional law on the subject. Unification Church made a lot of law on this subject, and the court said the Constitution prohibits excessive intrusion into beliefs and practices. All the agency can do is weigh the evidence to see whether the religion is bona fide. And the test for whether it can be considered a religious belief is whether it's sincere and occupies a place in the life similar to that of those who believe in God in organized religions here. So you don't have to believe in God. It just needs to have that place in your life. And when you look at what we were doing there, all of those people, by the end, a few thousand people trying to build a city in the community where they could live in peace and pursue their awareness and consciousness and transformation and love and compassion. No way it could have withstood the Seeger case analysis. A main government focus was preconceived intent. That is, when Osho left India, he had a preconceived intent to stay here. And basically, the law that looks at that is that preconceived intent to remain has to mean, as the cases say, you'll do whatever you have to do to stay. Mostly it's applied to people who swim a river or come across a border secretly, take a new name, etc., etc. I mean, given the profile of Osho and his community, I mean, was there any chance in hell from the very beginning that he was going to hide and sneak through and stay? No. And from the very beginning, we hired the best lawyers available. When it came to immigration, I wasn't one of those. But we hired some of the best lawyers available to get their best advice, and we followed it. So, a wish to remain in the United States, if you can do so legally, is not preconceived intent. How could he have had anything more than a wish, given the fact that we were in the legal process from the beginning? And at this point, one thing that's really important to distinguish is between Osho's intent and Sheila's intent. I don't really have much doubt that Sheila's intent from the time she invited him was to find a way for him to stay. Again, I think it was a wish on her part. She knew she would have to do it legally, but I'm pretty sure that from the time this property was being sought, she was hoping he'd stay, and she was hoping she could find a legal way to do it. But even that intent is a wish, not an intent to violate the laws, so he could stay. Again, this was all in a bright light. It couldn't be different. Again, dual intent is that you can want to stay, but only do so if it's legal, and that the Lauvik case supported that. Again, knowing, in order to have intent, you've got to have knowing and willful proof of the defendant's knowledge and his specific intent to commit the crime. There's never been any evidence that Osho did anything but come when Sheila invited him to come, sign papers that were put in front of him so he could stay. He didn't even like the place very much. I remember one time I got called in. I didn't see him all that much until after Sheila left, and then I saw him every day. But not too long before Sheila left, I got called in, and I sat down in front of him, and he said, "You seem to be afraid." I said, "There's nothing to be afraid of." He said, "If we lose this place, we'll go somewhere else." And then he kind of leaned toward me in a confidential way and said, "It's not so nice. You know, this is a guy from India and its climate. This was not his kind of place." And he was not, which again goes to an interesting thing about intent. If you're enlightened, I mean, it's very hard for us as a bunch of unenlightened people to project our values and way of seeing things on an enlightened person. Enlightenment can be defined as the permanent disidentification from the ego mind. So you actually have distance from the mind, distance from the body. You can observe it. He was free of desire. What he wanted to do was change the consciousness of the planet. And he came here because he thought, when he was invited, because he thought this would be a place where it could happen. After a couple of years, we filed rebuttals to these decisions. Tremendous amount of evidence and detailed evidence. Here's some of the stuff we covered. And those were never responded to because then events took place. Eventually, because the INS couldn't respond to those things meaningfully, they had to refer to Mr. Weaver, which they did. One of the key points was to find preconceived intent, you had to disregard all the medical evidence that he had serious problems and came here to get them taken care of. The INS said two things. One, in saying he can't be a religious teacher and leader, they said he's too ill to work. And the very same day, they issued a decision on the other side saying, oh, about his health, they're making it up. Disregarding the competent medical evidence. One of the reasons that they couldn't act administratively is because they've made so many mistakes. No medical testimony to support their opinion at all. District Director and Tom Casey decided suspicions cannot substitute for evidence, and they just didn't have the evidence. After 3.5 years, we were in court, and it wasn't in court saying then to grant the visas. We were in court to say, make a decision. Make a decision. And at that time, they said to the court that after 3.5 years, they hadn't even determined the scope of the investigation. This is in your Oregonian. So as I said then, some guy named Naran, who was much younger and thinner, said, when you have an investigation, you got a crime, you go look at something to see who did it. This was not like that. This was simply finding a way to get rid of this guy. Finally, in February 1984, February 16, which happened to be my birthday, it was a great gift in a way, they said, yes, he's a religious teacher. I mean, this was after there were letters from mountains of people and all of this stuff. They had no way of avoiding it. But so in order not to have to make the decision to let him stay, they didn't make any decision on the application for adjustment of status. That just remained in abeyance. In late 84, Attorney General Frohnmeyer proposed a task force to deal with the community. Essentially, every law enforcement organization in the state was involved in that task force except us, including military forces. On October 23, 1985, an indictment was issued. Basically, it was conspiracy and false statements. We became aware, we had been told by a member of the press that there was an indictment coming. But we didn't know what it was. We were really concerned because of the potential for violence if you have like the National Guard coming in carrying a bunch of guns. Some months before, Peter Shea, who was a really good lawyer and still is, lives in Los Angeles, very well-known immigration lawyer, he had a conversation with Turner, and these are his notes saying that if there is an indictment, we'll have the opportunity for voluntary surrender. But then when the time came, on the 28th of that month, I was with Peter Shea in our offices in the Hotel Rajneeshpuram. We had called Charles Turner 3 or 4 times. And ultimately, Turner just kept saying that he wouldn't confirm that there was any indictment whatsoever, and he wouldn't discuss voluntary surrender. So I was on the phone to the people back at the ranch because we were all really talking about the need for voluntary surrender to avoid the potential for problems. And I got a call from somebody, and I said, he won't negotiate with us. There's nothing we can do. It was decided by others, without my knowledge, to put him on a plane and take him someplace where he'd be safe. Some people, some sannyasins associated with Hassia, had fairly big money from North Carolina. They had a big place up in the mountains. And that was a place he could stay. So an airplane was leased, 2 planes, and in front of the press, in front of government officials, government agencies, he got on the plane and the plane took off. If this is flight, it was really not well done. You should be a little more secretive than to do it in front of the press and government officials. In addition, the flight they took was the longest possible way to go across the United States. Look at us. I mean, how soon could they have been in Canada? How soon could they have been in Canada? I mean, a half an hour in jets? Instead, they go all the way across the United States. The INS, after Osho was arrested, said it had attempted to get Osho to surrender. That's a lie. First, Turner wouldn't even confirm that there was an indictment, wouldn't discuss voluntary surrender. So we had no... And at that time, if you think about it, if he says, I won't talk to you about an indictment, I won't talk to you about surrender, as far as anybody is concerned, they're free to travel if they want to travel. There's no indictment. The highest law enforcement official in Oregon from the United States government said, I'm not going to confirm an indictment and I'm not going to discuss voluntary surrender. So it was decided to take him someplace safe. Again, I just want to say from the very beginning, people keep saying Osho this and Osho that. You know, Osho in the United States and for a year before in India lived in silence and seclusion except to speak to the couple people who were helping him, people in his house, people who take care of his body. So none of this is about his intent. It's about the intent of the people around him who wanted to make him safe or whatever they wanted to do. But it isn't his intent. And there was no evidence whatsoever that he had knowledge or intent or any intent to break the law or knowledge that he was breaking the law. After the bail hearing in Charlotte was denied, They took 12 days to get him across to the United States. It was a very well-known approach the government sometimes takes to soften people up. A deal was negotiated. I got to tell you a story. Judge Levy granted bail. And when the government opposed the bail, one of the things Judge Levy looked down and he said, well, you know, if you convict this guy, what are you going to do? And they had to acknowledge they were going to deport him. And so he said, so if he escapes, then... So he granted bail. He came back to the ranch. The next day, I was visiting with him, and I was there with Jack Ransom and Peter Shea and Brian O'Neill. I had hired all those guys on behalf of our community at different times. Jack Ransom was a former AUSA, hell of a guy, good lawyer, had gone to the other side, retired recently, very good lawyer. Big funny guy from Tennessee, told great stories, always even-tempered, always present, always helpful to us. Peter Shea was this guy, he's a South African guy, lives here for many years, knows more about immigration law than almost anybody, litigates it constantly. Brian O'Neill had been a partner of mine at a big firm in Los Angeles, and he had been the head of special prosecutions for the Justice Department. And I brought in Brian O'Neill at that juncture because Judge Levy was from Notre Dame, Mr. Weaver was from Notre Dame. We call them domers because of the Golden Dome. And I really wanted to have somebody who they would have some respect for and listen to. And Brian O'Neill was another domer and was very big in the Ninth Circuit as a criminal defense attorney. So we're all in Osho's room. We're all sitting down. And he was several times throughout this whole thing, he would look to me and go, like when he was in jail in Charlotte, he'd look to me and he'd go, why am I here? Why am I in jail? And I would have to explain to him the government's theories because he had no idea. He had never read any application. He had never been fraud. He was invited to come, so he came. So we're all sitting there, and he says, okay, what are we going to do now? And all three of our attorneys, I said, he looked at me, he said, Naran, what are we going to do now? And I said, well, all of these men know more about this body of law than I do. Why don't we let them speak? And all three basically said the same thing, that this was one of the weakest cases they had ever seen for a criminal prosecution, and they were sure that we could win. And so then it got to me, and he looked at me and he said, Naran? I said, well, you know, these guys know more about the law than I do, but having seen what the United States government has been willing to do so far, even after we win these cases, I don't think they're going to let go. I think they're going to stay after you until they find a way to get rid of you. There already was a RICO case. And again, although there was no evidence of Osho's wrongdoing at all, and the government acknowledged that, certainly they weren't going to give up. They weren't going to stop. I said, my advice, I think you need, I can't guarantee your safety. I can't guarantee your safety. Come on, I have less than about a third of the time they've had. Give me a few more minutes. I need a bit more than that. I need a bit more than that. You didn't stop anybody else. You asked him to get to the end. So, I said, I don't think we can protect your safety. I think you need to go. So he said, okay, make an arrangement and I will leave. And we did. Jack Ransom came after me after talking to whoever at the U.S. Attorney's Office he was dealing with. He said, it was like Christmas morning under the tree. For them to get rid of this case and Osho to leave was just what they wanted, the only thing they wanted. When Osho made the plea, he specifically said, it's called an Alford plea, He asserted his innocence and wanted to, and expressed his concern to the court that his concern was possible danger or harassment to him and his followers if he were to remain, and that's why he entered into the plea. After the case against Sheila was resolved, the press was after Mr. Turner, the U.S. attorney. Why did they let Osho go? And he said very specifically, the government did not have sufficient evidence to convict Rajneesh of other charges. We felt that if he left the country, the movement would disband. So the goal was to get rid of him and our community dies. That's what he was after, and that's what he got. Turner also said later in an interview that there was a lot of pressure from very high levels, and that the U.S. Attorney's Office became the court of last resort. What are we going to do with these people? How are we going to get them out of here? They're totally entrenched. He acknowledged that the Immigration Service realized that they couldn't exclude him. They couldn't deport him. Shortly afterwards, there was another letter from from Senator Hatfield, and he expressed his confidence in Mr. Turner and all of the other people involved, Lowell Jensen, Alan Nelson, the head of the INS, and acknowledging he'd been having contact with those people for years, working with them, putting pressure on them to get rid of Osho. There was a study done in 1990, and that study showed that the press was almost overwhelmingly negative against us while we were here. Briefly as to the marriages, when Turner acted on the marriages, he said in light of Osho's views, he didn't believe anyone could have a valid marriage. So is that saying, like if the Pope says you can't do birth control, that means you haven't done birth control? People make their own decisions. More than anything else, I mean, Osho spoke against marriage, but his biggest speaking was for people's freedom, having their own right to choose. The test, again, if Sheila could find a crooked way to do things, she would do that rather than do it straight. I was not her favorite person. We could have done all those marriages legally. And if the government wasn't so involved in the whole fraud thing, if they had looked at the test is, do they intend to establish a life together? Certainly the people involved in those marriages wanted a life together with their spiritual teacher. Under that standard, under the Unification Church cases, that's enough. It can be a valid marriage. Instead, Sheila correctly understood that all of these forces were arrayed against the community, and that we were fighting for our survival in a bunch of arenas. And because she had to keep raising the money, she was aware that it was costing an immense amount of money. So she was correct in her perception of that. Her choices of how to respond to that were nuts. Poisoning in the Dalles, trying to kill Osho's doctor, those things just, it does show one thing. They talk about power corrupts, absolute power. Sheila had abused her power, and at the time of these events toward the end, Osho was getting ready to replace her, but before it could happen, everything went the way it went. In an article, there was an article in a academic publication that said that the legal action by the state and federal government shows the immense power of governmental entities to deal effectively with unpopular religious groups. Give me a couple more minutes so I can talk just a bit about church and state. I'll just be a few minutes. I understand. I understand, but I need to at least address. I've talked a lot less than anybody else. But trying to address all three of them. Let me briefly address the church and state. It'll only take me a minute. I haven't. But I've had to respond to a bunch of other people. How long have I been talking? Okay. I'll be done in a couple of minutes. The core of the church and state case as brought by the government was that the land there was owned by a religious organization. And that was true. The case in the Grumet case, citing an earlier case, they said essentially any group of people can form a city. Now, what the government didn't do, what the Attorney General didn't do, was required by the Constitution as interpreted in Sherbert versus Werner. And that is because of the conflict between the Establishment Clause and free exercise, you have to use the least intrusive method possible in order to stop the establishment, but have as little impact as possible on free exercise and association. That was the law of the land. Now, Dave Frohnmeyer had spoken publicly before and after. He didn't like that balancing test. He wanted an absolute test, but at the time it was the law of the land, and he ignored it. The least restrictive way would have been, again, just a brief context. By the time the motion for summary judgment was heard in the church-state case, Sheila was gone. OSHA was gone. We could have easily changed the ownership of the land so it wasn't in a religious entity. Sheila was gone, so Sheila certainly wouldn't have been doing any violations of the Establishment Clause. The government, the Attorney General's office wasn't interested in that. They simply wanted the city declared null and void and ignored the Constitution and ignored the facts in order to make that happen. Thank you.
I think what we'd like to do, if the other folks are willing to stay for a little bit, and I understand that this has been a long time, and I am sorry that we didn't sort of shut everybody down after 5 minutes and bring my lights, but I think what I would like to do is to have the panelists come up, including you, Niran, and Judge Gelderks, and we're going to do this the way the Democratic candidates did for just about 10 minutes. We've got some questions that we just want to ask people really quickly, and you'll get like a minute to respond. So, Judge Gelderks, come on up here. Let's not even sit down. Let's just stand up here. If people can stand, stand over here, guys, because I think that this was we've heard some really interesting comments, and I will start with the one, and this fellow understands what we're talking about here. He says 30 seconds or less. For each of you, what are you most proud of during this episode? Bill Gary.
I'm most proud of the career professionals of the Department of Justice who, under very difficult circumstances, did their jobs.
Judge Gelderks.
I'm proud of the fact that no party ever asked me to step aside from any of the cases, and also proud of the fact that none of my decisions were reversed by a higher court.
Niran, what are you most proud of?
I'm the most proud of the people who devoted their lives getting no money, no compensation, giving up what they were doing before to build this community based on a desire and attention to being an example about the possibility of transformation of the planet through meditation and love.
Bob Weaver.
Well, as I said before, I'm very proud of the citizens of Oregon who I think thought at times that their government was going to be able to do nothing in the face of what they see as these insurmountable attacks at all different levels, but at the end did trust us to do our job, and that the Oregon congressional delegation, which was getting all kinds of pressure, backed off us and let us take the time to do our job. Wheels of justice grind slowly, and this is Exhibit A to that.
Now, I hadn't noticed that person said last question, but that would have been a good last question. But I do have a couple others. And again, I want a 1 minute answer, although I do want to direct one to Prem, and this really actually applies to, in one version or another, to everybody. Who do you blame for the way things played out? Sheila, obviously, Sheila and her circle, or was her conduct at least an understandable reaction to public hostility? You've talked about that as well. Very briefly.
Can I have as much time as your question?
You could have, 30 seconds. You can have a minute. There may be multiple people to sort of...
I didn't get your question.
My question was, who do you blame for the way things played out? From your perspective, things did not play out well. The Rajneeshpuram went away, was disbanded.
I'm not much into blame.
Okay.
I'm not much into blame in the sense that Osho said that if you act out of awareness, you'll do the right thing, no matter what the law is. But we need the law because people aren't aware. People who are unconscious are going to do what they're driven to do. While they have responsibility, in a sense, everybody's trying to wake up in their own way, in their own time. And for these gentlemen, they're trying to do the right thing in their own way.
Let me phrase it.
Responsibility.
Sure.
From the beginning, when Ed Meese reached out to the INS and the IRS to try and find a way to get rid of him, until it finally happened. That was their goal, and that's what they intended to do, and they effectuated that. That's their responsibility. I felt that Osho had a tremendous amount to offer in terms of the transformation of the planet, and instead of letting that happen, they throw him out.
Okay, let me follow up on that, though, Bob. We see an Ed Meese note from 1981, but you said the investigation, at least as it affected your office, didn't really get going until 83 or 82 at the earliest, right. 83 more likely.
What we chose to do was not because of any pressure from the INS or from Ed Meese, Attorney General Meese, and certainly despite the clumsiness of the Immigration Service in this district, we had to do our own thing. And you know, when it comes to the blame issue, I guess I don't look at it blame-wise, but I would ask you to consider, those who've stayed, and thank you, consider this, that if you looked at the criminal spectrum, you know, if this was all criminal conduct in this spectrum, you have aggravated murder, treason, terrorism at one end, and down here, I don't know what the lowest crime in the world would be, maybe barbering without a license, but immigration fraud is very close to that end and this end. They were willing to try to kill the United States Attorney and the Attorney General of Oregon in order to stop this. Well, it wouldn't have worked. It just would have brought all kind of hell down on their head. But it tells me two things. One is their zeal so exceeds their judgment, this control group, and I don't point to Naren on this. Certainly Sheila, for sure, and I don't exonerate the Bhagwan at all. But that their zeal exceeds their judgment by such a gigantic amount that they are dangerous. They will do anything. And secondly, I think that tells you that they knew that if we brought this case as low as it is on that spectrum and got convictions, the whole house was going to collapse. And it tells me that they knew that Bhagwan was good for this crime.
Okay. But just to make sure everybody understands, now Bhagwan, the only crimes charged, at least, against him were immigration fraud-related crimes.
Correct.
And Naren was not charged with any crimes.
Correct.
By either state or federal authorities, just so everybody's clear about that. Bill, you mentioned you brought this big Brico case. This was the biggest criminal enterprise, the biggest bioterrorism. Do you think that this was a dark conspiracy from the get-go, or did it become darker over time? It certainly became darker over time. Or were the seeds of the problem there at the beginning?
My own personal view is that the land use case and the church-state case and the immigration case were an existential threat to Sheila and her power, and others who participated in the conspiracy, and they developed a plan B, which was to take over the county. And the steps that were taken, the homeless people program and the poisonings, were directly a part of an attempt to suppress the vote and to increase the size of the vote of the Rajneesh voting bloc. And when that didn't work, they turned to more extreme measures, including assassination plots and the like.
Judge Gelders, you were living in Hood River, and you were the judge there in Wasco County. You talked about your respect for the lawyers, and you were on the list of the good judges that Naren had, and you said didn't get overturned. When these issues started showing up in your courtroom, did your view of Rajneeshpuram and the people that were in charge of it at least change over time as these other things came to light?
Oh, I think so. Originally, I thought this was a very interesting experiment that just might work. Unfortunately, in my view, Sheila turned out to be like many people, perhaps most people. I feel psychologically she was unable to deal with unrestrained power. As has been pointed out, made me a strong believer that power does corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't know if she started out as an evil person. I'd like to think not. She wrote me a very nice letter when my daughter died in Australia in June of 1983. I'd like to feel it was a heartfelt letter, that it was things that she was saying from her heart, not just trying to snow me. At the end, she was doing some very evil things in order to protect her power, which was challenged not only from without, but from within the organization itself, and she began to strike out. I really felt that she'd gone around the bend when she started bussing in the homeless people. I thought, this is never going to work. This is the beginning of the end.
Naren, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, just for 1 minute. Sheila did some stupid things, no question about it. Then again, I've had clients for many years. Many of them did stupid things. But this was on a much bigger scale. But Sheila did no more than to help the government's cases, creating a smokescreen with her public persona of hostility and the things she did in terms of her actions that severely affected the church and state case, immigration cases. But it was no more than a smokescreen to assist the government in the government's intention, especially on the INS immigration side and the U.S. Attorney, from what Charles Turner said. He said in there that we were using the legal system to solve a political problem, which is not the best way to do it, and that they wanted to destroy the community getting out of the state. So for 5 years, they prosecuted that, and Sheila knew that they were after us, and she just took entirely inappropriate, illegal approaches, which ended up helping the government.
Yeah. Okay, two other questions, and then we'll let you go. Or maybe three. This is to our law enforcement folks, Bill and Bob Weaver. Oregon has a long and not very pretty history of discriminating against people on the basis of religion, Catholics, on the basis of ethnicity, race. What concern about that history of Oregon and the need to play fair and avoid that kind of bias and intolerance, what role did that play in the prosecutorial decisions that you were making? I mean, I know you'll say it played no role, but you must have thought about that, and the Attorney General's opinion speaks to those things. 1 minute.
Well, I think we were very conscious of the fact that there was a lot of hostility toward this group, justified or not. At the time that we were working on the church-state opinion, we were very conscious of the fact that there were those that would love to see them run out of the state on a rail. And it was our commitment that we were going to do what the law told us we needed to do. You can argue the case on the other side. Naren did then and did again tonight, but there really is no basis to challenge the good faith of the lawyers who were doing their level best to figure out what the right response was to that. So as for criminal charges, as a prosecutor, you go where the facts take you, and that's what we tried to do.
Bob, do you want to add anything to that or not?
Just this. This is the 80s, and in those days, walking from my office to lunch, you would encounter Moonies, Hare Krishnas. The Scientologists would want to take you in for that free personality test. I think that in those days we were, maybe it's changed now, we were an extremely tolerant collection of people, Oregonians. And because they were so far removed out there in the eastern Oregon, I think had they not been instigating all of this criminal conduct, they might still be there today. I mean, 12 or 15 people pled guilty, went to prison. Some fled the country, including Rajneesh, to oppose, to get away from being apprehended. One went into the witness protection program. I don't know what objective, neutral people would say, but I would think they would say there's something going on here. There is some serious, systematic criminal activity. And so we have an obligation to go forward. And I can tell you we were called biased and prejudiced and stuff all the time by somebody on the ranch. And if that does anything, it makes you check yourself all the time. So you're not doing that.
What was the turning point, though? There was a lot of support, a lot of liberal support in liberal Portland for the Rajneeshis, and there was a feeling these rednecks and antelope and Central Oregon generally are hostile to them because of the Eastern religion and the different lifestyle. And at some point, that started to turn, even in places like Portland, and that presumably. You folks were litigating it at the time, and was it the poisonings? Was it the salmonella thing? But suddenly this seemed really a potentially very serious threat to a lot of people's lives. Was there a turning point? And Naren, I wonder if from your perspective too, you must have felt you were supported by a lot of lawyers in the ACLU and others in Oregon initially, and that sort of faded away maybe and maybe it was not until Sheila left and Bhagwan discloses some of Sheila's content. But I'd like to hear maybe first from the law enforcement guys who are trying. Yeah, but you can stand up or sit down. Bill, Bob?
Well, I'll tell you
Yeah.
what you think about it.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what I think turned the tide if there was a moment. 2,000 homeless people were brought to this ranch for one purpose, not to house them and take care of them as they were told, and they were bussed from all over the United States and put here. They were brought for the purpose of being an instrument to take over the Wasco County government so that the control group, Sheila, and others, and I would put the Bhagwan in this category because he's not doing nothing. You're right, we didn't charge him.
How do you know that?
Because I had witnesses, and I want to point this out to you too. When those people said to you, this is the thinnest case in the world, or words to that effect, I had given them no discovery. They didn't know who my witnesses were or what they were going to say.
You filed your proffer.
But and so we'll leave it at that. But on the homeless thing, when that didn't work out, those people were dumped on the streets of Portland and Madras and Hood River to fend their way for themselves and find their way home. 2,000 people. Where was the heart and mind of all the Rajneeshis who were not in that control group at that point? One Rolls Royce, had it been sold, would have bought a first-class ticket on an airplane back home for every single one of those men.
Bill.
That's the turning point, I think, in terms of people's attitude.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
I think that contrary to what Naren has suggested, I don't think Oregonians as a people were hostile. I think that, and my experience in working with the state government officials was that by and large they wanted to find a way to coexist. They wanted this not to be a firefight that would turn into something really ugly. And we were equally as concerned about what might happen from the locals who were hostile to the Rajneeshis as vice versa. But to me, I think what turned the tide was a steady drip, drip, drip of information that came out of the commune about what had been going on over the course of the last 3 years or so.
There were some dissatisfied people who'd left and started saying things about what Sheila was doing beforehand, right?
Yeah. Right. And I think, it's for many of us, it's easy to be sympathetic to the idea of I want to create a utopia and I want to meditate and find my higher self. I don't think Oregonians thought that was a bad thing, but as they discovered the sort of rotten core of the leadership team and what Sheila had been doing with her cohorts, I think that was the beginning of the end.
Naren.
You have to distinguish between public opinion and the government. Public opinion initially, and again, there were polls that show this. In the beginning, there was a significant minority, not a majority, but a significant minority who was interested, didn't have a particular view, thought it might be interesting. Some people actually thought, wow, this could be really interesting to have in our state. As time went on, primarily because of some of Sheila's activities, that shifted quite a bit. The Share a Home program, again, was a stupid tactic to an actual perceived problem. She saw that the forces of the government were arrayed against them, and she saw that as a way, you couldn't take over the county, but you could get representation on the county.
And was there nobody, Naren, saying, hey, this is stupid, don't do this, this is just going to get us in more trouble? Was there anybody that could say that and not pay the penalty?
There were a number of times. Like one time, you talking about the adoption of Osho by Sheila's dad? Sheila called me in and said, oh, we found this adoption paper. What should I do with it? And I looked at her and I said, lose it again. I said, I don't care if it's accurate or not. It's not going to help us. They're not going to buy into this, and it makes us look stupid. But Sheila just had to make it about her and be right. But again, it was a bad tactic for an actual reality, and that was from the time Ed Meese brought the INS in, and with Tom Casey, George Hunter, Mr. Hausman. And then when it was transferred to Charles Turner, as he acknowledged in the quote, there was a lot of pressure from the top down to do something to get rid of these people. Sheila was no more than a smokescreen, a significant smokescreen. Yeah. I think she was much more significant in terms of public opinion, although she actually also screwed up all of the cases. Yeah. When you look at immigration, when you look at church and state, the stuff she did could have been done legally and could have been done without making her the center of things. But
Judge Eldridge, you want to respond to that? You're okay with that one?
Oh,
okay.
I appreciate it.
Let me ask one other thing to Prem. This is a deeper. Naren. Sorry, I know. I keep saying Prem but it's Naren. I know. Some and sort of think about Sheila. Think about Osho. Some psychologists who study charismatic religious leaders and their devoted followers suggest that to keep the followers in line and growing, the group has to sort of demonize others and outsiders. Cult is a pejorative term, but that's what it's sometimes called, and usually has destructive results for followers and for the group as a whole. Do you think some of that was going on there with Sheila and her group, or with others?
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if people aren't enlightened, they're motivated by fear and desire. And in Sheila's case, she actually accurately perceived we were under attack. But in the sense of when you say that sort of attitude, us and them, white people against black people, Israelis against Palestinians. In Bosnia and Serbia, you have these people of the same religion and look exactly the same, and they're still wanting to kill each other. Our species is a violent, dangerous species, and it happens. And you want to talk about cults, the Marine Corps and the Army. I was in the Army, and the Catholic Church and so many organizations are us and them about everybody else. It's the way our species operates.
Okay. Any other comments? We've kept Bob.
I'd like to just point this one thing out on the Netflix that I think has left a very bad impression. Although the guys who made this movie are from Hollywood, no serious consideration was ever given to having the Oregon National Guard invade that ranch. So I want you to know.
Well, I think when if we had more time, we got a lot of interesting questions like lessons learned, a lesson that was not learned, that was at least adhered to here in some respects by the government folks. There was not a Waco, it was not a Ruby Ridge. Things did not get to that point.
Yes.
From the government's perspective, and there were some bad acts by some bad actors in terms of the poisonings and the attempted murder, but this ended with no deaths directly related to either the Rajneeshis coming here or their departure later.
And no proof that he was involved in any of those.
And no proof. Right now, we didn't see Bob. We didn't see Bob's evidence. He would say,
yes.
Okay.
I had evidence on the immigration case. We had
evidence on the immigration.
We had
right.
suspicions on other things. But
right. If you'd had good evidence on other things, you probably would have charged those. Or if you'd had good evidence against Naran, you would have charged him.
As the Supreme Court Justice once said, suspicion and the willingness to believe the worst of people is not evidence.
Okay. Thank you all for staying this long.
Thank you.
Rob,
Hey, old man. Good help.